Well, have I got troubles? Now, I was planning to give you an interesting talk, an introductory talk about Charleville in the 1860s. I prepared all sorts of things. In fact, I prepared this. But as you can see, I have troubles. Now, I'm a talented person, I'm sure. Many people have told me that, but I'm not very good at writing backwards. And how, for God's sake, I solve this problem, I don't know. But what I want to talk about in a series of videos, I hope, is Charleville in the 1860s. Now, it's often said that there's very little material available about Charleville in the 1860s, and that somehow or another is a matter that it excuses the fact that there really isn't a great deal of history written about Charleville in that time. But that's not quite true, because if you go to the newspapers of that period, there really is plenty, and there really should be very few gaps, because the material really is there. Probably the best of the people who went to those and wrote a real history of Charleville was Claire Wagner, and it's a great history. Many people may find it a little difficult to read, but it really is quite good. There was a teacher in the school in the about 1935 through until probably in the early 40s, I think, Alan Morrison, and he gathered what material he could about Charleville's history, and a lot of it is really very good. Some of it is fairly terrible, really, because whoever told him what they told him, I think they were having a little bit of a guess, but by and large it's not too bad. But I also have spent a little bit of time I've also spent a little bit of time concerning myself with Charleville in the 1860s. Not all of Charleville, not through to 2022 or anything like that. I've been concerned only with Charleville in those first few years, just to try to sort out exactly what happened and why the problems that Charleville has today really developed from a very sad event, of course, in 1864. But anyway, in preparation for that, I suppose I've been at work. Well, I began this work in 1986, and then I left it aside for quite some years, and eventually I got back to it, and so I've now finished. And but to start with, I found this old slate. And now, who wrote on that slate? I really do not know. But this is what I began at school with. I began school in 1943, and that is certainly not as Toddy Connolly taught us to write. But nevertheless, we had slates, and we had slate pencils, and Toddy taught us all she could about pothooks and really being able to write the old inclined cursive script that we used to use. So I gathered that, and that's a really genuine slate from the school period. And those of you who are as old as I am will remember them and the slate pencils, and how, well, I made mistakes here tonight, and I smudged and so on. But of course, in those days we were supposed to bring a slate rag to school and a little bottle of water. But we could never afford anything that came in a bottle, and a jam tin was really not quite what you wanted. So we had two solutions, those of us in that particular predicament, and we simply spat on our slates, and then we smudged. But I've also got a couple of other things here that helped me along the way. There it is, all nice and backward. The Charleville Centenary booklet. I don't know how I solved that problem. There must be some way of doing it. But anyway, you read it backwards. It's the Charleville Centenary booklet of 1947. And what else did I find? Oh, yes. Those of you who are as old as I am, you'll remember these things, the Queensland School Readers. This tatty old one is grade 3. The Honest Woodman. What else can I find? The Tin Soldier. I never really liked that story. The Boy and the Wolf. Yes, that was a great one. Obey Your Parents. Oh, yes. This one about the Merchant and the Donkey. I always thought that was quite good. I've got the grade 4 one here. And, of course, I've got all of them. I was given them as a gift by an old student. And priceless. You can't buy them these days, but somehow or another she got them. Now, let me see. Oh, the Tar Baby. I enjoyed that one very much. Meddlesome Matty, I'm not quite sure about. The Gate Without a Latch, I can't remember that one. The Wind, okay. Oh, Jack and the Beanstalk was really quite good. But anyway, there was that. But that's what others have done. Now, what I did over the years was decide that there was really a lot of stuff in the newspapers of the period that was well and truly worth reading. And so I spent about 3 years gathering material, and at the end of it I thought, good God, I've really got the whole history of Charleville through to about 1901, because that's as far as my energy would take me. And so I then divided everything up into a series of subjects, and so I divided them into 8 volumes. The first one is about the town site and the weather and transport. The second one, well, I'll give you a look at that, of course, all back to front. Aren't I useless, you know, because nobody else who uses YouTube has this error. I don't know what the problem is, but anyway, put it down to me. Second one is to do with nothing but how the town grew from its first years, about 1864, 1862, if you want to go back that far, through to about 1901. Page 3, no, volume 3, Law and Disorder. Well, there's plenty there. Berenda, now most of you probably won't know Berenda, but Berenda was the first manifestation of today's Augathilla. It had a makeover later in the 19th century, and it became Ellengowan. I think the pub there is called the Ellengowan pub, and eventually it became Augathilla. And Augathilla, of course, a much more classy place than Berenda. Berenda was pretty wild, but I'll come to that as time goes by. Fourth one, Travellers' Tales, because later in the century newspapers were sending people around the country reporting on various towns, and some of their writing was really quite good and quite interesting. And there were isolated travellers, of course, who came through and who gave descriptions of Charleville, particularly in those years, 1860, I don't know when the first real description of Charleville was, probably 1866, I might have thought, maybe 1867, but certainly there was a description of it in 1868. There were 4 buildings in the town, and so it wasn't exactly a thriving settlement. There's another section here on living conditions, the bore, and then what I call bits and pieces that I dragged from wherever I might have got them, just to give some sort of colour to the background. Volume 5 is all about the Aboriginal population, and the Chinese, and the Afghans, and then I've got a section here called Mentioned in Dispatches. That's just about people who made the news from time to time. And last of all, recreation. That was quite interesting, because how people did spend their time and involve themselves in recreation is really quite interesting. There are all sorts of interesting things. There was a great race between the Copper & Co coach and the fellow on the bike, Charleville to Adavale, as I recall. There was a big craze for cycling towards the end of the 19th century and so on, but on and on it went, and so on. Where am I up to? Volume 5. Volume 6 is about elections and the people who represented the place. Not particularly well, I might mention. And then, of course, we come to the shearers' strike, but as a prelude to the shearers' strike, there was a strike of girls, I think. What was it? I don't know whether they were just girls working in shops in the town, or whether they were girls working in the hotels in the town. But anyway, they went on strike, and they were the women were some of the early industrialists, if we might call them that, in the 19th century. And then, of course, there was all the excitement of the shearers' strike. But I don't think Charleville ever really recovered particularly well from that. Volume 7, where am I up to? Yes, Volume 7 I call Supplement. Now that's a record of all of the burials in the Charleville Cemetery from 1896 through to 1939, the outbreak of the war. I stopped at 1939 because, well, I had no more time, and in any case I was probably pretty well worn out with typing. And but this particular volume is quite an interesting one, because it provides you with the date of the burial, it provides you with the name, usually spelt correctly, but not always, the age, the denominational section in which the person was buried, occupations, yes, where they were born. That's interesting. And let's see if there are any other sections here. No, cause of death. But anyway, in volume 8, I analyse all of that information and give a pretty thorough picture of the town as the picture that's given by the burial records actually provide. And so the volume 8 is probably the crucial one, because volumes 1 to 6 are simply copies, if you like, of the newspaper articles. It was intended as being a booklet, or these books were intended to be books of primary sources, the original documents of the period, without any commentary on my part. But put them together and you've got the whole story and you make your own history. But by the time we get to volume 8, that's all our own work, me and my brother. And it's got a number of parts to it. The first one, of course, is simply a history of early Charleville in those early years, 1864 through to about 1868, 1869. And though in the past people have said there isn't any information or very little, that's really not quite true, because there's a fairly detailed history of the first one, the new history. The information there is what actually happened. There's a lot of stuff written that says it's a history of Charleville. It really isn't. It's pretty inaccurate, and, well, very inaccurate, in fact. And what people thought of originally as the history of Charleville was really the history of the Janetsky family. They didn't intend writing a history of Charleville. Their descendants were writing stories about Mary Janetsky and her husband Louis and Louisa and so on. And but it was their story, and so, you know, it's a bit of exaggeration here and a bit of forgetfulness in a few other places, and you know, a bit of braggadocio from time to time. But nevertheless, that really wasn't the history of Charleville at all. But a real history is here, stating what actually happened. It's fairly brief, but it's worth looking at. Then I move on to the next section, because there was a great controversy going from, well, it started in 1864 and went through and wasn't settled until 1869, because Charleville was not really meant to be. The township was supposed to be at Mangalore. And, well, there was skullduggery afoot, and it ended up, well, what with skullduggery and what with Tully's incompetence, it ended up where it was, and so Charleville was cursed with floods for the next 100 and whatever years, with that work that went on in recent years. It's probably, and with the levee banks, it will have been alleviated to a great extent, one hopes. But of course, up until then, we had to live with the floods coming and going quite regularly, all because of Tully's work and because of the skullduggery that went on. And so the second chapter here deals with that, what I call the Charleville-Mangalore controversy. It was a very simple one. Mangalore was high banks and not flood prone at all. But the graziers or the settlers or whatever, the landholders, really didn't want it there, and they pulled strings. They made sure that there was no settlement at Mangalore. Charleville, on the other hand, was just sort of, well, part Tully's laziness and part Tully's incompetence, I think. He was headed for big things, and he knew he had a big job waiting for him back in Brisbane, so he didn't really bother spending. He knew he mustn't go into Mangalore, so he just found a place, and there were a few people camped at the crossing. Not Gary Crossing, but at what became known as Miller's Crossing. So he surveyed the land there, and that was the first town reserve, and Charleville's been stuck with it ever since. Then there was a struggle between those who wanted to stay at Charleville, because there's a bit of money to be made at the crossing. That's at the what they used to call the Upper Crossing and Miller's Crossing, and certainly not Gary Crossing. Gary Crossing, and the idea that the town formed at Gary Crossing is I think that began with Alan Morrison, if I remember rightly, in 1935, or whenever he began writing that history of his. He told all sorts of stories about the things at Gary Crossing. God, there was a hotel and, oh, you name it. But none of it is true. I mean, who would build a building at Gary Crossing? Even now, I think in my childhood, the only building I could remember there near the crossing was Tomato Thompson's very high house. And then there was a street there. It didn't have a name in those days, but I can tell you the houses in that street going up towards the bottom of Alfred Street were very tall indeed, I can tell you. The Chinese came there in the 1870s, and they started their gardens, and they got flooded from time to time, and they had to be rescued and so on. So there it was. But anyway, there we are. That's where the town was. There began in the upper crossing at what they called it's near Burke Street. Anyway, the bottom of Burke Street is where the crossing was, and so there was a contest between those who could pick up a few bucks, because that particular crossing, the upper crossing, was really a very easy crossing. Gary was not an easy crossing at all, and it may have been okay for those coming from the west. But in those days, people either came up the river, or predominantly they came down the river from what they call the upper Warrego area. That's, up the headwaters, up, beyond the Neve and Yo-Yo Creek and places like that. And I'll explain at some later stage how they actually got there. So the second chapter deals with that great controversy between Charleville and Mangalore, and how ultimately, who wins, and if you've got the money, you win. That's how Charleville ended by being where it ended by being. So then I move on, and the next chapter deals just with a short history of the Janetsky women. Father Flynn, was it Father Flynn? Yes, I think it was Father Flynn. He wrote a history of the Janetskys in 1938, I think it was. It's what I call a hagiography, sort of. He turned them into saints, and, they forgot a few things and exaggerated a few things. But anyway, I've amplified that to a certain extent. Then I moved on from there to the next chapter. They're called A Tale of Two Pubs. Now, the two pubs in that chapter are the Old Victoria. That was the pub that was began I think it began certainly in 1864, and it was first known in terms of a name as Cooper's Hotel. It was taken over, though, by the Janetskys, and eventually became the Victoria. And so the Victoria kept on going until it burnt down, I think, in 1916, and then it was moved to the block next door and became the New Victoria, and eventually it sort of, went the way of all things. And the other hotel, of course, was the Charleville, and as you know, Charleville is probably the only business in town that still in 2022, if it had some beer, would be the only business that retains the name that it had when it was first founded in 1867. It was 1867 by the almost everyone who had any money and had any go in them came from Roma in those very early years. And the Zemans started that particular pub in 1867, and so it continued on. The building that you see there now, I think, dates probably from the rebuilding of after 1931. And then I can't remember the earlier year just offhand. I'll have to look that up. But it burnt down in, I think, 1913, 1916, whatever. Burnt down again in 1931. And still standing. A great pity that it's empty. I always think there should be a use found for it. It's a wonderful location, and it's got great potential. Here we are, yes. In fact, it was run by a rogue called Eichmann. He was the mayor of Charleville at one stage, and even though most people don't know, he actually tried to raffle the hotel in, 1889. First prize, Charleville Hotel and Furniture. Second prize, 640-acre paddock. Now, whether my grandfather had a ticket in that or not, yes, my great-grandfather may have had a ticket in that, but if he were alive, he'd still be waiting for the result, because there was never any result declared. Eichmann was a very plausible rogue, a Swiss fellow, ran a good hotel apparently, although he did sue someone once for stealing an egg cup, and but he was a very wily creature. The railway station, should have ended up about 700 metres east of where it is now. because if it had been there where it was supposed to be, the traffic would have fed down Burke Street to what was the main part of town, the upper part of Alfred Street, near Burke Street. But of course that really didn't suit Eichmann very well, and he was really keen that the traffic from the railway flow down Will Street, and so by one means or another they got, at the last minute, the train line extended through to where it is now, and so the traffic flowed down Will Street to Eichmann's Hotel. Well, if the traffic flows down Eichmann's Hotel, you also wanted to flow up to Eichmann's Hotel, and in 1895, I think it was, the bridge was finally finished. Excuse me. No one particularly wanted the bridge where it was. I mean, who wanted all the carriers to be crossing over there in the middle of town? But Eichmann did. The carriers wanted the bridge a little bit further down the river, probably to where the bridge is now. I can't remember the name of that street. It's not Burke Street, but you're passing the Church of England and going out that way. And I'm a bit rusty with Charleville streets, I have to admit. But anyway, by the time Eichmann finished, he had the bridge coming over in 1895 and bringing the traffic up Will Street, past his hotel. And he also had the railway station bringing the traffic down Will Street towards his hotel. And so the centre of town really moved to the lower part of Alfred Street by that time, whereas previously the main part of the town had been up there towards Burke Street. And so eventually Eichmann departed and off he went. Then the next chapter is my analysis of those cemetery records, and I'll deal with them at some stage, but anyway. And then the final chapter is just wonderful articles that appeared in the newspapers that are too good to leave sitting in libraries. So that kept me going until this year. And now don't go into a bookshop and say, look, I want a copy of that work by those two Bilby boys, because you won't be able to buy it. We were convinced, that we weren't onto a bestseller here, and we certainly don't expect to appear in the international airline bookshops. And in fact, we don't even expect anyone, or we wouldn't have expected anyone even to buy them, even to read them. And so we've only got a few copies printed. Copies are in the National Library, copies in the State Library, and in our bookshelves, and a few spare ones that we've got. But it's a great pity because they're really worth having a look at, not to read right through, but to read, in bits and pieces along the way. Now, what I intend to do is go through all of those, and but today I was going to give you an outline of what I've been on about and where I plan to go. In the next chapter, we'll call it, I'm going to deal with just a general picture of the district as it existed in about 1860, from about 1860 through to about 1864. I mean, how did you get there? Who went there? That type of thing, because it's not quite as we think. I know for years I was quite confused because I just always assumed that if you came to Charleville from the east, you came out in a direct line, Roma, Mitchell, Morven, Charleville. But it wasn't quite like that. It was quite different. And if you don't understand how people moved in those early days to get to the point that we now call Charleville, there'll be a lot of stuff that will confuse you. So what I was going to do in the next talk was talk about Charleville in those early years, those early 1860 years, through to maybe about 1869, just to give you a picture of who was there, how they got there, what they did, the crossings they used, how they lived, how big the town was, and things like that, and what people had to say about the town, which was, of course, not always complimentary. So there we are. So that's my task, and that's what I hope to do. Well, I'm getting on. I'm 84 plus, and so I thought, well, don't do this soon. You'll need a Ouija board to get it out of me, so I will try to spare you of that. So anyway, that's what I'm going to do. Look forward to the next talk.